London, 1852. A single word spoken at a glittering ball would destroy everything Aria Whitlock had ever known. One sentence directed at the most dangerous man in England. One choice that would turn a merchant's daughter into an exile and ignite a war that would shake the foundations of an empire. But what happened in that smoke-filled factory 3 years later? What truth emerged from the flames that even the Duke himself couldn't silence? Stay until the end to discover how courage became revolution. Like this video, drop a comment with your city, and let's begin. The Ashford ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching on crystal chandeliers and bouncing off silk gowns that cost more than a factory worker earned in 5 years. Aria Whitlock stood near the edge of the marble dance floor, her emerald dress perfectly tailored, her posture flawless. Everything about her screamed refinement. Everything except the fury building behind her carefully neutral expression. She'd been watching him all evening. Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne moved through the crowd like a shark through shallow water, effortless, predatory, utterly confident. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his gray eyes. He wore his power like other men wore cologne. Everyone felt it. Everyone responded to it. "Stop staring," her mother hissed, gripping Aria's elbow with fingers that trembled slightly. Margaret Whitlock had the same sharp features as her daughter, but time and society had worn away whatever fire she'd once possessed. "You're making a spectacle." "I'm observing," Aria said quietly. "There's a difference. Observing will get you noticed. Being noticed by him will get you ruined." Aria's jaw tightened. Her mother wasn't wrong. 3 weeks ago, she'd watched Duke Hawthorne destroy the Pendleton family with nothing more than a whispered word to the right banker. Their shipping business, built over 2 generations, collapsed in 48 hours. All because young Thomas Pendleton had dared to court a woman the Duke wanted for himself. The woman in question, Lady Catherine Monroe, now hung on the Duke's arm like an expensive accessory, laughing at something he'd said with practiced enthusiasm. "He's a monster," Aria whispered. "He's a duke," her mother corrected, "and your father has business interests that depend on staying invisible to men like him. So smile, dance with Lord Carmichael when he asks, and for the love of heaven, keep your opinions to yourself." But Aria had never been good at that. She'd spent the last month doing something dangerous, asking questions. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. About the Duke's factories. About the conditions in his textile mills in Manchester. About the 16-hour shifts and the children who lost fingers in the machinery and the families evicted when workers complained. The numbers had made her sick. The stories had made her furious. And tonight, watching him glide through this golden palace of privilege, accepting bows and scraping courtesy from people who should have known better, something inside her finally snapped. "Miss Whitlock." The voice came from her left, smooth, cultured, and far too close. She turned to find the Duke himself standing there, one eyebrow slightly raised, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Up close, he was even more imposing. The candlelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the expensive tailoring of his evening coat, the cold amusement in his eyes. "Your Grace," Aria curtsied perfectly, buying herself a moment to control her racing heart. "You've been watching me all evening," he said, his tone conversational but edged with something harder. "I wondered if you'd have the courage to approach, or if you'd simply continue to glare from across the room like some avenging angel." Several nearby conversations stopped. Heads turned. The orchestra continued playing, but the music seemed suddenly distant. Aria felt her mother's fingernails dig into her arm. "I wasn't aware my attention had been so obvious," Aria said carefully. "My apologies if I've caused offense." "Offense?" The Duke's smile widened slightly. "No, Miss Whitlock. I'm rarely offended, occasionally annoyed, sometimes impressed. Which category you fall into depends entirely on what you do next." It was a test. She could feel it. The Duke hadn't walked across a crowded ballroom just to exchange pleasantries. He wanted to see if she'd back down, apologize, retreat into the safe territory of meaningless social chatter. Every instinct screamed at her to do exactly that. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "I was thinking about efficiency," she said. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something sharpened in his eyes. Efficiency? Yes, you own 17 factories across northern England. Textile mills, mostly. I was calculating the waste. The conversations around them had stopped entirely now. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. Aria was dimly aware of her mother's horrified gasp, of her father pushing through the crowd somewhere to her right, but she couldn't stop. The words were already forming, already rushing forward. Waste? The Duke's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath it now. You lose approximately 3 workers per month to injury or illness across your Manchester facilities alone, Aria continued. Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. Training replacements cost time and productivity. The hours you demand, 16, sometimes 18 per day, reduce efficiency by roughly 30% compared to well-rested workers. Children under 12 have a 40% higher error rate than adults, which damages your equipment and ruins materials. And the housing you provide breeds disease, which spreads through your workforce and causes prolonged absences. She paused, letting the silence stretch. From a purely business perspective, Your Grace, cruelty is expensive. The ballroom had gone completely silent. For 3 heartbeats, the Duke simply stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor whatsoever. Fascinating, he said softly. You've been conducting research, gathering information about my private business affairs, calculating costs and making judgments about decisions that are, frankly, none of your concern. He took a step closer, and Aria fought the urge to back away. Tell me, Miss Whitlock, are you always this presumptuous, or have I done something specific to earn your contempt? You've done quite a lot, actually, Aria said, and somewhere in the back of her mind she knew she was crossing a line from which there was no return. But what strikes me most is the waste of potential. Those workers could be building an empire if you treated them like human beings instead of disposable machinery. But you won't, because that would require seeing them as people. And people might demand things, might expect fairness, might refuse to be crushed. Aria, her father's voice, sharp with panic, stop talking, right now. But the Duke held up one hand, silencing him without even looking away from Aria. You think you understand my business, he said quietly. You think a few statistics and some sentimental bleeding heart nonsense about fairness give you insight into how empires are built. But you're a merchant's daughter playing at philosophy. You've never created anything, never risked anything, never stood in a room of investors and fought for every pound. You live in a pretty house built on your father's careful neutrality and your mother's social climbing, and you dare to lecture me about waste? The words hit like physical blows. Aria felt heat rising in her cheeks, felt the stares of every person in the ballroom burning into her skin. At least I can sleep at night, she said. The Duke's expression went completely flat. Can you? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Let's test that theory. Your father's business, those nice merchant ships he runs between India and London, they operate under contracts with 3 major trading houses. 2 of those houses have financial arrangements with my banks. The third owes me personal favors. Would you like to guess what happens to those contracts if I decide your father has become inconvenient? Aria's blood ran cold. You wouldn't? I absolutely would, the Duke interrupted. In fact, consider it done. By noon tomorrow, your family will begin to understand the actual cost of your principles. In 3 weeks, you'll have nothing. No house, no position, no invitations to balls where you can stand in your expensive dress and judge people who've accomplished more in a year than you will in a lifetime. He straightened, brushing an invisible piece of lint from his sleeve. Now, he said, his voice returning to its normal conversational tone, I believe this dance is ending. You should return to your parents. You'll want to spend time with them before they realize what you've cost them. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting before him like water. Aria stood frozen, her heart hammering, her hands shaking. Around her, the whispers started, a rising tide of shock and scandal and barely concealed satisfaction at watching someone else's downfall. Her mother reached her first, face white with fury and fear. What have you done? Margaret whispered. Oh God, Aria, what have you done? But Aria couldn't answer. She was staring at the Duke's retreating back, watching him rejoin Lady Catherine with an easy smile, watching the nobility of England flow around him with renewed deference and fear. She'd known there would be consequences. She'd prepared herself for social embarrassment, maybe even temporary exclusion from certain circles. She hadn't prepared for annihilation. The next morning arrived with gray skies and the sound of her father's study door slamming. Aria sat at the breakfast table, unable to eat, while her mother paced the drawing room with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. The servants moved through the house with unusual quiet, as if noise might attract further disaster. At 10:30, 3 letters arrived. The first was from Barclays Bank, politely informing them that the Whitlock family's line of credit had been reassessed and would no longer be available. The second came from the East India Trading Consortium, terminating their shipping contracts due to unforeseen complications in our financial arrangements. The third was from Lady Ashford herself, expressing deep regret that the Whitlocks would no longer be welcome at any events held under her patronage. Aria's father emerged from his study at noon, looking 10 years older. He didn't shout, didn't rage. That would have been easier. Instead, he simply looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "Pack your things. You're going to your aunt's estate in Derbyshire tonight." "Father, you will not speak." His voice was flat, empty. "You will not argue. You will pack what you can carry, you will get in the carriage when it arrives, and you will leave London. If you have any remaining love for your mother and me, you will do this without protest." Margaret had started crying, soft, hopeless sobs that echoed through the silent house. "I didn't mean," Aria started. "It doesn't matter what you meant," her father interrupted. "It only matters what you've done. The Duke of Hawthorne has declared war on this family, and the only way to survive is to remove the provocation. You." The word hung in the air like an executioner's blade. 3 weeks, he continued. "That's how long the Duke said we had. In 3 weeks, we'll lose the house, the business, everything we've built. Unless you disappear. Unless you become invisible. Unless you give him no further reason to maintain his attention on us." "So I'm being exiled," Aria said quietly. "For telling the truth." Her father's face hardened. "You're being saved. From yourself, if nothing else. Your aunt will take you in. You'll live quietly. You'll help her with her charity work. You'll speak to no one about what happened here. And if God shows us any mercy at all, the Duke will eventually lose interest and allow us to rebuild what you've destroyed." He turned toward the stairs, then paused. "Your mother wanted sons," he said without looking back. "I told her daughters were just as valuable, just as capable of intelligence and strength. I was wrong. A son would have known when to keep silent." The words cut deeper than anything the Duke had said. Aria sat alone in the drawing room as the gray afternoon light faded, listening to her mother's continued weeping from upstairs, staring at the 3 letters that had arrived to pronounce judgment on her pride. She'd been so certain she was right, so convinced that speaking truth to power mattered more than social survival, so sure that someone needed to challenge the Duke's cruelty. Instead, she'd accomplished nothing except her family's ruin. At 6 o'clock, the carriage arrived. Aria descended the stairs with a single trunk, wearing a traveling dress of plain gray wool, a far cry from the emerald silk of the previous night. Her mother embraced her with desperate strength, whispering broken apologies and recriminations in equal measure. Her father didn't come out of his study. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she'd ever known, Aria looked back at the elegant townhouse with its white columns and expensive windows. Candles were being lit for the evening, but there would be no guests tonight. No parties. No laughter. Just silence and fear and the slow process of calculating how much could be salvaged from the wreckage of one daughter's defiance. The carriage turned a corner and London disappeared behind her. Aria pressed her forehead against the cold glass and finally allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from rage. Rage at the Duke. Rage at a society that protected men like him. Rage at her own helplessness. But underneath the rage, something else burned. A spark. Small, stubborn, refusing to be extinguished. The Duke thought he'd won, thought he'd crushed her, thought exile and family shame would teach her the proper place of merchant daughters who dared to challenge their betters. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He'd freed her from everything she had to lose. The journey to Derbyshire took 2 days. Aria spent them staring out the carriage window, watching London's smoke and stone give way to rolling hills and scattered villages. The further they traveled from the capital, the more the weight on her chest seemed to ease slightly. Not from relief, but from a growing sense of clarity. She'd spent her entire life operating within a system designed to keep her silent and obedient, following rules created by men like the Duke to protect their power, trading authenticity for safety, courage for comfort. And what had it gained her? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Her aunt's estate appeared on the third afternoon, a modest manor house surrounded by bare winter fields. Not poor, but not wealthy. Respectable, quiet. The kind of place where scandalized nieces could be hidden until society forgot their names. Aunt Beatrice met her at the door, a thin woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Aria painfully of her mother before London had worn her down. "So you're the girl who challenged a duke," Beatrice said without preamble. "Either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Aria admitted. Her aunt studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Brave and stupid can be worked with. Come inside, you look half frozen." The house was smaller than their London townhouse, but warmer somehow. Fires burned in every room. The furniture was simple but comfortable. The servants, only 3 of them, smiled when they took Aria's trunk. Beatrice led her to a sitting room overlooking the gardens and poured 2 glasses of sherry without asking if Aria wanted one. "Your mother wrote," Beatrice said, settling into a worn armchair. "Quite a dramatic letter, actually. Lots of weeping prose about ruined reputations and ungrateful daughters. Your father's was shorter, more direct, essentially asking me to lock you in a room until you learn proper humility." "Are you going to?" Aria asked quietly. "Lock you up?" Beatrice laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "No, I'm going to put you to work. I run charitable operations throughout the county, food distribution, medical assistance, job placement for displaced workers. You'll help. You'll see what actual poverty looks like, not just calculate statistics about it from a comfortable distance." She paused, studying Aria over the rim of her glass. "And then," she continued, "we'll see if you still have the courage of your convictions, or if exile has taught you the lesson your parents hoped for, that silence is safer than truth." Aria met her aunt's gaze directly. "I wasn't wrong," she said, "about the Duke, about the factories, about any of it." "No," Beatrice agreed. "You weren't wrong. You were just ineffective. There's a difference. Being right doesn't matter if all you accomplish is your own destruction." She stood, moving to the window overlooking the darkening fields. "The Duke of Hawthorne is a bastard," Beatrice said bluntly. "Everyone knows it. But knowing and challenging are 2 different things. He's protected by wealth, title, and the entire structure of English society. You had passion and statistics. In that battle, passion loses every time." "Then what's the alternative?" Aria demanded. "Just accept it? Pretend children aren't dying in his factories? Ignore everything because he's too powerful to fight?" "No," Beatrice said. "You learn strategy. You build allies. You find leverage. You stop approaching power head-on and start looking for its weaknesses." She turned back to face Aria. "Your parents think I'm a harmless old woman doing harmless charity work. They're wrong. I've spent 20 years building networks, gathering information, helping people who remember favors. I know things about half the nobility in England that would make your scandal look like a children's tea party." Something shifted in Aria's chest, a flutter of possibility. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you reminded me of myself," Beatrice said. 30 years ago, I stood in a room much like that ballroom and said something I shouldn't have. Cost me a marriage, a fortune, and any chance of the life I'd been raised to expect. Difference is, I had nowhere to go. No one to teach me how to fight properly, so I learned the hard way." She finished her sherry and set the glass down with deliberate care. "You have a choice, Aria. You can spend your exile learning humility and proper feminine silence, then return to London a broken example for other girls who might have dangerous thoughts. Or you can spend it learning how power actually works, how to challenge it without destroying yourself in the process, how to build something that can't be crushed by one duke's wounded pride." "I want the second option," Aria said immediately. "I thought you might." Beatrice smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that reminded Aria of a blade catching light. Then let's begin. The first week at her aunt's estate, Aria learned what real poverty looked like. Not statistics, not calculated figures in a ledger. Real poverty, the kind that smelled like unwashed bodies and rotting teeth, that sounded like children's persistent coughs, that felt like calloused hands too worn down to grip properly. Beatrice took her to the villages, small clusters of cottages where displaced factory workers had fled after injuries made them useless to their employers. Families living on charity and whatever work they could scrape together. Women doing laundry for pennies. Men with missing fingers trying to repair tools with hands that no longer functioned properly. "Look at them," Beatrice said quietly, as they distributed food parcels in a village called Millbrook. "Really look. These are the people you defended in that ballroom. Do you still feel righteous about it?" Aria knelt beside an older woman whose face was a map of exhaustion and resignation. The woman's daughter, maybe 16, sat nearby with a baby that cried weakly, the sound of a child not getting enough milk. "Where did you work before?" Aria asked gently. "Hawthorne Mills," the woman said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Manchester. My husband lost his arm in the machinery. They gave us 3 days to clear out of company housing. Told us he should have been more careful." The daughter looked up, eyes hollow. "We walked here. Took 11 days. The baby came early." Aria felt something crack open in her chest. Not pity, which was useless, but a cold, focused rage that made her earlier ballroom defiance seem like a child's tantrum. "How many families from Hawthorne operations are here?" she asked. The woman shrugged. "Maybe 20 in this village. Hundreds more scattered throughout the county. We all end up in the same places eventually. Far enough from the cities that no one has to see us. Close enough to beg if we get desperate." That night, Aria sat in her aunt's study with a pen and paper, writing down names, locations, injuries, timelines. Beatrice watched from her chair by the fire, saying nothing. "What are you doing?" she finally asked. "Building a record," Aria said without looking up. "You said I needed strategy. Strategy requires information, evidence, patterns that can't be dismissed as isolated incidents. And what do you plan to do with this evidence?" "I don't know yet." Aria's hand cramped, but she kept writing. "But the Duke destroyed my family because I challenged him with nothing but moral outrage. Next time, I'll have more than that." "Next time?" Beatrice's eyebrow rose. "You're planning to go back?" "Eventually." Aria looked up, meeting her aunt's gaze. "Not to beg forgiveness, not to apologize, to finish what I started, properly this time." Beatrice smiled that sharp, dangerous smile again. "Good. Then tomorrow I'll introduce you to someone who can help." The someone turned out to be Caleb Rowan. He arrived at the estate 2 days later in a carriage that had seen better years, wearing a coat that was expensive but worn at the cuffs. Mid-30s, Aria guessed. Tall and lean, with light brown hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that assessed everything with the careful precision of a man who'd survived by being smarter than his opponents. "Miss Whitlock," he said, bowing slightly as Beatrice made introductions in the drawing room. "I've heard about your London adventure, brave, foolish, expensive." "All three," Aria agreed. "And you are?" "Caleb Rowan. I own textile mills in Yorkshire. Smaller operations than the Duke's empire, but profitable enough." He settled into a chair with the ease of someone comfortable in any environment. "Your aunt thought we should meet." "Because you hate the Duke?" Aria asked bluntly. Caleb laughed, a genuine sound that reached his eyes. "I don't hate him. Hate requires emotional investment. I simply recognize him as a problem that needs solving." "A problem?" "The Duke of Hawthorne doesn't just run factories," Caleb explained. "He shapes entire markets, sets wage standards so low that competitors like me have to choose between matching them or losing contracts. He's making industrial labor into a race to the bottom, and every mill owner in England either participates or goes bankrupt fighting it." He leaned forward slightly. 3 years ago, I tried to organize a coalition, mill owners willing to maintain better working conditions and pay fair wages. We had 12 committed members. Within 6 months, the Duke had systematically destroyed 9 of them, not through competition, through banking pressure, contract manipulation, and targeted economic warfare. The remaining 3 got the message and fell in line. Why didn't he destroy you? Aria asked. Because I'm careful. I don't challenge him publicly. I don't make dramatic speeches at balls. His smile took the sting out of the words. I survive by being too small to bother with and too connected to eliminate easily. But I've been collecting information for years, waiting for the right moment, the right leverage. Beatrice poured tea with deliberate care. Show her. Caleb pulled a leather folder from his bag and spread papers across the table. Financial records, contract documents, correspondence between the Duke's factory managers and various banks. The Duke's empire isn't as stable as everyone thinks, Caleb said. He's overextended, borrowed heavily to expand into new markets. His profit margins are thin because he's undercutting everyone else. One significant disruption could cascade into a serious crisis. Aria studied the documents, her mind racing. But you haven't used this information. Because I can't, Caleb's voice hardened. I'm a mill owner. If I start making accusations, everyone assumes it's commercial jealousy. The Duke destroys my credibility in an afternoon, but you, he paused. You're different. You've already paid the price for defying him. You have nothing left to lose, and you have something I don't. What's that? A story people will listen to. A young woman ruined for speaking truth. It's compelling, sympathetic, harder to dismiss than a competitor with an axe to grind. The pieces were starting to come together in Aria's mind. You want to use me as a weapon against him. I want to offer you resources, Caleb corrected. Information, connections, financial support if you need it. What you do with those resources is your choice. But yes, if you decide to continue your fight against the Duke, I'll help. Not from altruism, from practical self-interest. Aria looked at her aunt, who nodded slightly. There's a cost, Beatrice warned. Caleb is giving you the tools to go to war, but war has consequences. Your family's already been damaged. This could make it worse. Could put you in actual danger, not just social embarrassment. The Duke doesn't forgive twice. I know, Aria said quietly. Then to Caleb, what exactly are you proposing? Over the next hour, Caleb laid out a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. He had contacts in London, journalists, reformers, members of parliament who were quietly disturbed by the Duke's methods. People who wanted to challenge the system but needed a catalyst, a public figure who could give voice to their concerns. There's a movement building, Caleb explained. Factory reform, workers' rights. It's been simmering for years, but it needs a spark. Someone who can make the public care about people they've been trained to ignore. And you think I can be that spark, Aria said. I think you already are. You just don't know it yet. The story of what the Duke did to your family is spreading, whispers at first, but growing. People are talking about a merchant's daughter who dared to speak truth and was crushed for it. That's powerful. It makes people angry, makes them think about who really has power and how they use it. He shuffled the papers, pulling out a newspaper clipping. This ran in the Manchester Guardian last week. Small item, buried on page 7. But it mentions you, calls you the young woman who challenged aristocratic brutality. The editor is sympathetic to reform. He'd publish a longer piece if you gave him your story. Aria's hands trembled slightly as she took the clipping. Her name in print. Her defiance turned into something larger than herself. My parents would never forgive me, she said quietly. No, Beatrice agreed. They wouldn't. They want you to disappear, to let the scandal fade. Going public would be the opposite of that. It would make everything worse for them. It would also protect them, Caleb interjected. Right now, they're vulnerable because you're isolated. But if you become a public figure, someone with supporters and attention, the Duke can't quietly destroy them without drawing exactly the kind of scrutiny he avoids. He works in shadows. You'd be dragging him into daylight. It was a gamble. A dangerous, irreversible gamble. But sitting in that drawing room, looking at the evidence Caleb had collected and thinking about the families she'd met in Millbrook, Aria felt something shift. She'd spent her whole life being careful, being appropriate, following rules designed to keep her powerless. And where had it gotten her? Exiled, humiliated, watching her parents suffer because she dared to speak. Maybe it was time to stop being careful. All right, she said. Tell me how this works. The plan took shape over the following weeks. Aria would write her story, not as a victim, but as an eyewitness to systematic exploitation. She'd connect her personal experience to the broader pattern of abuse, names, dates, numbers, the kind of detailed account that couldn't be dismissed as emotional exaggeration. Caleb provided the factory records. Beatrice offered testimonies from displaced workers she'd helped over the years. Together, they built something that looked less like a personal grievance and more like an indictment. But writing it was harder than Aria expected. She sat in her small room night after night, staring at blank pages, trying to find words that captured what she'd seen without sounding like propaganda. The first draft was terrible, too angry, too personal, too much like a woman scorned rather than a reformer exposing injustice. "Start with them, not you," Beatrice advised, reading over her shoulder. "The families, the workers. Make readers see their faces before you mention the Duke. Make them care about the people, then show who's crushing them." Aria rewrote it, and rewrote it again. By the fifth draft, she had something that made Caleb nod with satisfaction. "This is good," he said. "Strong, specific. It doesn't read like revenge, it reads like documentation." "Because it is documentation," Aria said. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, her hands stained with ink. "Every claim is verified, every number cross-checked. He can't dismiss this as hysteria." "He'll try," Beatrice warned. "The Duke will attack your credibility, call you bitter, mentally unstable. A woman scorned spreading lies for attention. You need to be ready for that." "I am ready." She wasn't, not really, but she sent the piece to the Manchester Guardian anyway, along with a letter explaining who she was and why this mattered. The editor's response came within 3 days. "We'll publish. Next week's edition. Front page." Aria held the letter with shaking hands, feeling the weight of what she'd just set in motion. There was no taking it back now, no retreat into quiet exile. She'd just declared war on one of the most powerful men in England. That night she wrote to her parents, a short letter explaining what she'd done and why. She didn't apologize, didn't ask permission or forgiveness, just told them the truth and said she hoped they'd understand someday. She never sent it, couldn't bring herself to put that pain into an envelope and dispatch it to London. Instead, she burned it in the fireplace and watched the words turn to ash. The article ran on a cold February morning. Beatrice brought the newspaper to breakfast, unfolding it silently on the table. There it was. Front page. A column and a half of text under the headline, "The Hidden Cost of English Progress, One Woman's Account of Industrial Cruelty." Aria read it 3 times, her coffee going cold beside her. Seeing her words in print made them real in a way that handwritten drafts never had. This wasn't private anymore. This was public, permanent. Thousands of people would read this, including the Duke. "Well," Beatrice said quietly, "you've done it now." "Yes," Aria agreed. Her voice was steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I suppose I have." The response came faster than expected. Within 2 days, letters started arriving at the estate. Some supportive, people thanking her for speaking out, sharing their own stories of exploitation and loss. Others vicious, calling her ungrateful, hysterical, a disgrace to decent women everywhere. One letter came from her mother. Aria recognized the handwriting and almost didn't open it. "How could you? How could you make everything worse? Your father's business is barely surviving. We've lost nearly everything, and you repay our sacrifice by humiliating us further in a public newspaper? You are no daughter of mine." The words cut deep, but Aria forced herself to read them twice. This was the cost. This was what fighting back actually meant. Not triumph, not vindication, just pain and the hope that something meaningful might grow from it. Caleb arrived that afternoon with more newspapers. The story was spreading. Other publications had picked it up, running their own versions, interviewing factory workers, asking questions about the Duke's business practices. "You've started something," Caleb said, spreading the papers across Beatrice's dining table. "Look, the Times is calling for parliamentary inquiry. The Reform League is organizing meetings. People are paying attention." "The Duke will respond," Aria said. "Oh, he already has." Caleb pulled out the London Observer. "Read the editorial on page 4. Aria found it quickly. A scathing piece calling her a disgruntled young woman peddling unsubstantiated accusations against a pillar of English industry. It questioned her mental stability, her motives, her right to make public declarations about matters she fundamentally misunderstood. But what caught Aria's attention was the byline. not a staff writer. A paid advertisement. The Duke himself had commissioned this response. "He's scared," she said, looking up at Caleb. "If he wasn't, he'd ignore me. The fact that he's responding means I've hit something that matters." "Or it means you've made a powerful enemy even angrier," Beatrice countered. "Don't mistake reaction for weakness. The Duke is protecting his interests, violently, if necessary." "Violently?" Aria's stomach tightened. Beatrice and Caleb exchanged glances. "There's something you need to know," Caleb said carefully. "About the Duke's pattern. He doesn't just destroy people financially. Sometimes people who threaten him have accidents. Nothing provable. Nothing that points directly back to him. But there's a pattern." He pulled out a folder containing newspaper clippings. 3 years of reports about reformers, journalists, and business rivals who'd experienced sudden misfortunes. A warehouse fire. A carriage accident. A factory collapse. All involving people who'd publicly challenged the Duke shortly before their disasters. "You think he's behind these?" Aria asked, her mouth dry. "I think he's a man who solves problems," Caleb said, "and you've just become a very visible problem." The fear that Aria had been suppressing rushed forward. This wasn't a game. Wasn't a debate or a battle of words. Men with the Duke's kind of power didn't just argue back. They eliminated threats. "Maybe we should stop," Beatrice said quietly. "Pull back before this goes further. You've made your point, published your account. That's more than most people ever do." But Aria was looking at the clippings, seeing the pattern Caleb had identified. A journalist who'd written about unsafe working conditions, killed when his house burned down. A mill owner who'd tried to organize better wages, dead in a suspicious riding accident. A parliament member who'd proposed factory regulations, mysteriously bankrupt and discredited within months. The Duke didn't just protect his empire, he actively crushed anyone who threatened it. And Aria had just painted a target on herself. "No," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Stopping now would mean they won. Would mean every person who died or suffered did so for nothing. If the Duke is willing to go this far to protect his system, then the system needs to be destroyed." "Aria," Beatrice started. "I know the risks," Aria interrupted. "I know what I'm choosing, but I've already lost my family, my future, everything I was supposed to become. The only question now is whether that sacrifice means something or whether it's just another story about a woman who spoke up and got crushed for it." She stood, pacing to the window. Outside, winter was giving way to early spring. The fields were still brown, but there was a hint of green underneath. "Caleb, you said there's a movement building. People who want reform but need a catalyst. I'll be that catalyst. But I need more than newspaper articles. I need to reach people directly. Make them see what's happening. Make it impossible to ignore." Caleb leaned back, studying her with new interest. "What are you proposing?" "Public speeches? Workers' meetings. I'll go to the cities where the Duke has factories. I'll stand in front of the people he's exploiting and tell them they don't have to accept this. That there are people willing to fight for them. That change is possible." "That's dangerous," Beatrice said flatly. "The Duke's territory, his people. You'd be putting yourself directly in his reach." "Good," Aria said. "Let him try to silence me in front of hundreds of witnesses. Let him show everyone exactly what kind of man hides behind aristocratic titles." Caleb was nodding slowly. "It could work. The Reform League has been organizing workers for years, but they need new energy, fresh voices, someone who can connect with people emotionally, not just intellectually." "When do we start?" Aria asked. "Give me 2 weeks to set it up," Caleb said. "I'll arrange meetings in Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, places where anger is already simmering. You just need to give it direction." After Caleb left, Beatrice cornered Aria in the hallway. "You understand what you're doing," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "No, I don't think you do." Beatrice's voice was harder than Aria had ever heard it. "You're about to step into the Duke's world wearing his anger like armor. But anger isn't enough. You need to be smarter than him, faster, more careful. One mistake and you won't get exile. You'll get a carriage accident or a house fire or some other tragedy that everyone will call unfortunate but inevitable." "Then I won't make mistakes," Aria said. "Everyone makes mistakes," Beatrice countered. "The question is whether you survive them." 2 weeks later, Aria stood in a workers' hall in Manchester, looking out at 300 faces. Men and women who'd spent 14 hours that day in factories. People with exhaustion carved into every line of their bodies. Children who should have been in school but were instead sitting beside parents who couldn't afford to leave them home. The Duke's territory. His city. His workers. Aria's hands shook as she gripped the podium, but her voice came out clear and strong. "My name is Aria Whitlock," she began. 3 months ago, I stood in a ballroom in London and told a duke that cruelty is expensive. He destroyed my family for it, cast me out of society, made me an example of what happens to women who speak above their station. She paused, letting the words settle. But here's what he didn't expect. Being destroyed freed me. I no longer have to be careful, no longer have to protect a position in a society that values comfort over justice. And I've spent these months learning about you, your names, your stories, your suffering. She pulled out her notes, pages of testimony, statistics, names. Sarah Mitchell, age 13, lost 3 fingers to machinery at Hawthorne Mill No. 7. Compensation? Nothing. James Bradford worked 16-hour shifts for 11 years before his lungs gave out from cotton dust. Pension? None. The Roberts family, evicted from company housing when the father complained about unsafe conditions. Current status? Homeless. The hall was completely silent now. These aren't just numbers, Aria continued. These are people. Your neighbors. Your family. And the man responsible, Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne, sits in London counting the profits built on your blood and sweat while telling Parliament that workers are lazy, that better conditions would make you weak, that you should be grateful for the opportunity to destroy yourselves building his empire. Anger rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted agreement. Others joined in. "But I'm not here to just make you angry," Aria said, raising her voice above the noise. "Anger without action is useless. I'm here to tell you that change is possible, that there are people, mill owners, journalists, members of parliament, who are willing to fight for reform, who want to build a system where labor has value beyond how cheaply it can be bought, where children go to school instead of losing fingers in machines, where a man's lungs matter more than quarterly profits." She gripped the podium tighter. "The Duke thinks he's untouchable, thinks his title and his wealth protect him from consequence. But power only exists because we give it. Every person who works in his factories, who accepts poverty wages, who stays silent while others suffer, we're the foundation his empire stands on, and foundations can crack." The crowd was on its feet now, shouting, applauding. Aria felt the energy in the room like a physical force, rage and hope, and desperate need for someone to tell them things could be different. In the back of the hall, she saw a man in an expensive coat slip out the door. One of the Duke's people, no doubt, reporting back that the exiled merchant's daughter was stirring up workers in Manchester. Let him report. Let the Duke know she was coming. After the meeting, Caleb found her in the back room, where she was drinking water and trying to stop her hands from shaking. "That was extraordinary," he said. "I've never seen workers respond like that. You have a gift for this." "I just told them the truth," Aria said. "You made them believe change is possible. That's more than truth. That's hope. And hope is dangerous to people like the Duke." Over the next month, they held 6 more meetings: Leeds, Birmingham, Liverpool. Each one drew bigger crowds. Each one ended with workers pledging to organize, to demand better conditions, to stop accepting the Duke's terms as inevitable. And each one brought Aria closer to direct confrontation with the man who'd destroyed her family. The confrontation came in Sheffield at a meeting Caleb had arranged in a converted church. 400 people packed into pews, with more standing along the walls. Aria was midway through her speech when the doors at the back slammed open. Guards entered first, 6 men in the Duke's livery, carrying clubs. They spread out along the walls, their message clear. Then he walked in. Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne, dressed in a traveling coat and boots, strode down the center aisle like he owned not just the building, but every person in it. The crowd shrank back instinctively, decades of conditioning making them defer to aristocratic authority even here, even now. He stopped 10 feet from the podium, looking up at Aria with an expression of cold amusement. "Miss Whitlock," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Still making speeches, still peddling lies, I have to admire your persistence, if not your intelligence." Aria's grip on the podium turned her knuckles white, but she forced herself to stand straighter to meet the Duke's gaze without flinching. 400 people held their breath around her, waiting to see if she'd crumble under the weight of aristocratic authority standing in their midst. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying through the converted church. "I didn't realize you made a habit of attending workers' meetings. Are you here to listen or just to intimidate?" A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the crowd, quickly dying when the Duke's guard shifted positions along the walls. "I'm here," the Duke said calmly, "to witness firsthand the damage you're doing, to see what a disgraced merchant's daughter looks like when she trades truth for applause." "The only one trading truth is you," Aria shot back. "These people know what happens in your factories. They live it every day. I'm just giving them words for what they already understand." The Duke smiled, cold, humorless. "You're giving them false hope, telling them that system built over generations can be dismantled by emotion and speeches. That's not hope, Miss Whitlock. It's cruelty dressed up as compassion." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice shifting into something almost conversational. "I employ 18,000 workers across England, 18,000 people who have jobs, housing, wages, however modest, because I took the financial risk to build something. You call me cruel. I call myself practical. The world doesn't run on sentiment, it runs on economics. And economic reality is that labor must be affordable, or there's no profit. No profit means no business. No business means no jobs at all." Several workers shifted uncomfortably. The logic was seductive in its simplicity, better exploitation than starvation. Aria felt the energy in the room changing, fear and pragmatism wrestling with the anger she'd spent weeks cultivating. She had to act fast. "Economic reality," she repeated, stepping down from the podium to stand on the same level as the Duke. The guards tensed, but didn't move. "Let's talk about that. Your Manchester factories generated approximately £300,000 in profit last year. Your workers, the ones creating that profit, averaged £60 annually. Some mathematics. If you reduced your profit by just 10% and distributed it among your workforce, each person could earn £75. Still profitable for you. Life-changing for them." The Duke's expression didn't change. "You've been studying my finances. How thorough. Did Caleb Rowan provide those numbers? I assume he's here somewhere, hiding behind your skirts like the coward he is." "I'm right here, Hawthorne." Caleb emerged from the crowd, moving to stand beside Aria. "And unlike you, I don't need guards to have a conversation." "You need my former employee turned spy to steal confidential records," the Duke countered. "Don't pretend your hands are clean." "Everything I gave her is public record," Caleb said. "Filed with Companies House, reported to Parliament. You just don't like having your own numbers used against you." The Duke's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed facade. "This is pointless. Miss Whitlock, you're wasting everyone's time with fantasies about economic reform. These people need to work. I provide work. End of discussion." "No," Aria said quietly. "Beginning of discussion. Because I'm done letting men like you decide what's possible and what isn't. These workers deserve—" "Deserve?" The Duke's voice rose sharply. "You want to talk about deserve? I deserve to run my businesses without interference from failed socialites playing at Revolution. These workers deserve employment, which they have. What they don't deserve is to have their heads filled with dangerous ideas by someone who's never built anything, never risked anything, never done anything except ruin her own family with adolescent defiance." The words hit like physical blows. Aria felt heat rising in her face, felt the shame and guilt she'd been carrying for months threatening to overwhelm her. But then she looked past the Duke at the faces in the crowd. Sarah Mitchell's mother, whose daughter had lost fingers. James Bradford's widow, still coughing from the same dust that had killed her husband. The Roberts children, thin and hungry because their father had dared to complain. "You're right," Aria said, her voice steady again. "I haven't built an empire. Haven't made fortunes or created thousands of jobs. All I've done is listen to people you've taught yourself not to see. And I've discovered something interesting. They're not asking for charity. They're asking for fairness. A living wage, safe conditions, basic human dignity. And if that's too expensive for your business model, then maybe your business model is the problem, not the workers." The Duke stepped closer, close enough that only Aria and Caleb could hear his next words. You've made a serious mistake coming here, he said quietly, stirring up my workers in my city. Did you think I'd just allow this? That there wouldn't be consequences? What are you going to do? Aria challenged. Destroy my family again? Already done. Exile me? Already there. Kill me in front of 400 witnesses? Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Not quite anger, not quite respect. I don't have to kill you. I just have to wait. Your movement will collapse on its own. Reform sounds beautiful in speeches, but it dies when reality sets in. When workers realize that demanding higher wages means losing their jobs entirely. When mill owners like Rowan here discover that competing against my prices requires matching my methods. When Parliament decides that protecting profits is more important than protecting people. He stepped back, raising his voice for the crowd again. Go ahead, Miss Whitlock. Keep making your speeches. Keep filling these people with false hope. But when you're done playing revolutionary and have moved on to your next cause, they'll still be here. Still needing work. Still dependent on men like me who actually understand how the world functions. And I'll remember every face that cheered for you today. The threat was clear. Participate in this movement and face retribution when it failed. Several workers near the front began edging toward the exits. Others looked at the floor, unwilling to meet either Aria's or the Duke's eyes. The fear was spreading, doubt replacing the brief flare of courage. That's what I thought, the Duke said softly. He turned toward the door, his guards falling into formation around him. But he never made it outside. The explosion came from somewhere south, a deep, thunderous boom that shook the church's foundation and rattled the old stained glass windows. Everyone froze for a heartbeat. Then chaos erupted as people rushed to the doors and windows. What the hell? Caleb started. Through the windows, Aria could see smoke rising into the evening sky. Thick, black smoke billowing from somewhere in the factory district, and beneath the smoke, she could see flames. That's Hawthorne Mill number 4, someone shouted from the doorway. The big textile factory on Carver Street. The Duke was already moving, shoving through the crowd with his guards clearing the way. Aria grabbed Caleb's arm. We need to go, now. Aria, that's his factory, his problem. We should... People are in there, Aria interrupted. I don't care whose factory it is, there are people inside. She ran after the Duke, ignoring Caleb's protests. Outside, the streets were filling with workers and families, everyone moving toward the fire. The smoke was visible from blocks away, a massive column rising against the darkening sky. By the time Aria reached Carver Street, the scene was nightmarish. The factory's west wing was engulfed in flames, fire pouring from broken windows on 3 floors. Workers stumbled out of the main entrance, coughing, blackened with soot. Some were helping others who couldn't walk. A woman screamed that her daughter was still inside. The Duke was already there, coat discarded, shouting orders at his factory manager, a thin man who looked close to panic. How many people were on shift? The Duke demanded. Maybe 200. We've got about half out. The west stairwell collapsed. Anyone above the 2nd floor is trapped unless what? Unless someone goes up the east stairwell and gets them down before the whole structure fails. The Duke looked up at the burning building, his jaw set. Then, without a word, he started toward the entrance. Your Grace, you can't... The manager started. Find me a wet cloth, the Duke ordered, not slowing down, and get water pumps on the east wall. Now! Aria ran after him, yanking off her shawl and dunking it in a water trough someone had set up for the escaped workers. The Duke glanced back, surprise flickering across his face when he saw her. What are you doing? Same thing you are, Aria said, wrapping the wet cloth around her face. Saving people. This isn't a game, Miss Whitlock. The building's unstable. The fire's spreading. You'll die in there. Then we'll die together. She pushed past him toward the entrance. Are you coming or not? For a moment, the Duke just stared at her. Then he grabbed a wet cloth from another worker, covered his face, and followed her into the inferno. The heat hit like a wall. Even through the wet cloth, the smoke choked her, made her eyes stream. The main floor was chaos. Overturned machinery, scattered tools, flames crawling up the western support beams. The Duke grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the east stairwell. 2nd floor, he shouted over the roar of flames. That's where they'll be trapped. The stairs were wooden, already starting to char from the heat radiating through the walls. Aria took them 2 at a time, her lungs burning, her heart hammering. Behind her, the Duke matched her pace, steady despite the madness. The second floor was worse. Thick smoke obscured everything more than a few feet away. Aria could hear screaming, coughing, desperate voices calling for help. She moved toward the sound, nearly tripping over a fallen beam. "Here!" A man's voice, ragged with smoke. "Over here! We can't get past!" Aria found them huddled near the north wall. Maybe 30 workers, mostly women and children, blocked by a section of collapsed ceiling that had cut off their escape route. The Duke appeared beside her, assessing the situation with quick, practiced efficiency. "Can we move it?" Aria asked. "Not without bringing down more of the ceiling." He looked around, squinting through the smoke. "There's a service ladder on the far wall. Goes down to the loading dock. If we can get them there." The building groaned, a deep structural sound that made everyone freeze in terror. "We need to move now," the Duke said. "Can you lead them while I clear the path?" Aria nodded, turning to the trapped workers. "Follow me. Single file. Stay low. Don't stop for anything." She didn't wait to see if they obeyed, just started moving toward where the Duke had indicated, trusting that fear would motivate them better than commands. Behind her, she could hear the Duke shoving debris aside, his breathing harsh through the wet cloth. The service ladder was exactly where he'd said, a metal framework bolted to the exterior wall, leading down to the loading platform 1 floor below. Aria tested it, felt it hold steady, then started helping workers onto it. "Climb down, fast as you can. There's a platform at the bottom." They went in a desperate stream, mothers pushing children ahead, men helping the injured, everyone coughing and stumbling but moving. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. Aria's vision was starting to blur, her lungs screaming for clean air. She'd gotten maybe half of them down when the second explosion hit. This one was closer, somewhere on the first floor. The whole building shuddered. The metal ladder shrieked as its supports twisted. Aria grabbed the framework to keep from falling, felt the Duke's hand close around her wrist. "The boiler," he gasped. "The fire must have reached the boiler room. The whole place is going to come down." "Then we need to get everyone out right now," Aria said. They worked in desperate tandem, Aria guiding workers onto the ladder, the Duke physically lifting those too weak or injured to climb themselves. The building groaned again, louder. Chunks of ceiling started falling, crashing onto the machinery below. "Last one," the Duke said, helping an older woman onto the ladder. "Now you. Go." "What about you?" Aria demanded. "I'm right behind you. Go!" Aria grabbed the ladder, started climbing down. Her hands were slick with sweat and soot, making the rungs difficult to grip. Halfway down, she looked up and saw the Duke following, his face a mask of determination and exhaustion. Then the east wall buckled. It happened in terrible slow motion, the support beams twisting, the brickwork crumbling outward, the entire section of wall where the ladder was attached pulling away from the building. The Duke lunged for a different handhold, missed, and fell. "No!" Aria screamed. But he caught himself on a protruding beam maybe 8 feet down, his grip slipping on the charred wood. Below him was a 20-foot drop onto concrete and metal debris. Aria didn't think, just acted. She climbed back up, ignoring the workers below shouting at her to come down, ignoring the fact that the wall was still collapsing around them. She reached the beam where the Duke hung, braced herself against what remained of the ladder framework, and held out her hand. "Grab on." "You can't hold my weight," the Duke gasped. "I don't need to hold it. Just steady yourself enough to swing to the platform." Their eyes met through the smoke and flames, and Aria saw something she'd never expected to see in Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne's face. Genuine fear mixed with something that might have been respect. He reached up, grabbed her wrist. Aria felt the full weight of him testing her grip, felt her shoulder scream in protest. But she held on, using the ladder for leverage, giving him the stability he needed to swing his legs toward the loading platform. He made it, barely. Crashed onto the metal platform with a sound that made Aria wince. Then he was up again, reaching back for her. "Jump! I'll catch you!" The wall gave another sickening lurch. Aria let go of the ladder and jumped. The Duke caught her, his arms wrapping around her as they both went down hard on the platform. For a moment they just lay there, gasping as the wall finally collapsed completely behind them, sending a shower of bricks and burning timber crashing down where they'd been seconds before. "We need to move," the Duke wheezed, pulling himself up. The whole structure's failing. They stumbled off the loading platform just as the entire east wall came down. The workers who'd escaped were backing away, horrified and transfixed by the building's death throes. Aria felt Caleb grab her, pulling her further from the collapsing factory. "Are you insane?" he shouted. "You could have died in there." "So could they," Aria said, gesturing to the workers they'd saved. She looked around, trying to count heads through the smoke and chaos. "Did everyone make it out?" "Most," Caleb said grimly. "Not all. The West Wing collapsed before we could reach everyone." The reality of that settled over Aria like a physical weight. People had died tonight, workers who'd come to do their shifts and never made it home. While she'd been making speeches and the Duke had been making threats, somewhere in this factory a fire had started that had killed innocents. She looked around for the Duke, found him standing 20 feet away with his factory manager, both of them staring at the burning ruins of Hawthorne Mill No. 4. The Duke's face was black with soot, his expensive clothes torn and scorched. He looked nothing like the composed aristocrat who'd walked into that church meeting hours ago. As she watched, a man in worker's clothes approached the Duke, one of the factory foremen Aria recognized from earlier meetings. "Your Grace," the foreman said, his voice shaking. "There's something you need to know about the fire." The Duke turned, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "It wasn't an accident." The foreman's hands twisted together nervously. "I was doing final rounds on the 3rd floor before shift change. I saw someone in the boiler room who shouldn't have been there. When I called out, he ran. 5 minutes later, the explosion happened." "You're saying someone set this fire deliberately?" The Duke's voice had gone very quiet. "Yes, sir. And I recognized him. He works for—" The foreman glanced around nervously. "He works for Marcus Brennan." The name meant nothing to Aria, but she saw the Duke's expression change. Shock, then fury, then something that looked almost like betrayal. "Brennan," he repeated. "You're certain?" "Positive, Your Grace. I've seen him at the riverside warehouses where Brennan operates. He's one of his regular muscle." Caleb appeared at Aria's elbow, his face grim. "Brennan is a shipping magnate," he explained quietly, "runs half the smuggling operations in northern England. He's been pushing to expand into legitimate trade for years, but the Duke's been blocking him." "Why would he burn down a factory?" Aria asked. "To make a point," Caleb said, "or to create chaos. Brennan's been trying to consolidate power in the industrial sector. If he can destabilize existing operations, buy up failing businesses, position himself as the solution to the problems he's creating—" He was interrupted by the Duke's voice, raised in command. "Get me everyone who was in the building tonight. Workers, foremen, managers. I want statements from anyone who saw anything unusual in the last week. And send word to the magistrate. If Brennan thinks he can attack my operations without consequence, he's made a fatal error in judgment." The Duke started issuing orders with the same efficiency he'd shown inside the burning building, organizing the injured, arranging housing for displaced workers, setting up investigation procedures. Aria watched him work, seeing something she hadn't expected. Not the cruel aristocrat of the ballroom, not the cold businessman of her research, but a man who'd just run into a burning building to save workers he supposedly didn't care about, who'd nearly died on a collapsing wall, who was now making sure everyone affected by this disaster was taken care of. It didn't match. Nothing about this night matched what she'd expected. She approached him slowly, aware that she probably looked as terrible as he did, covered in soot, clothes torn, hair falling out of its pins. "Your Grace," she said. He turned, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people who'd spent months as enemies, standing in the wreckage of something neither had anticipated. "Miss Whitlock," he said finally, "you saved my life in there." "You saved 30 others," she replied, "including children. That's not the action of a man who sees workers as disposable machinery." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Don't romanticize tonight. I did what any reasonable person would do in a crisis. It doesn't change the economic realities we were arguing about 2 hours ago." "Doesn't it?" Aria challenged. "You risked your life for people you claim are just labor resources. That suggests you value them as more than profit margins." "I value the stability of my operations," the Duke countered. "Dead workers mean investigations, bad publicity, regulatory pressure. It's practical self-interest, nothing more." But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. Before Aria could respond, another commotion erupted near the factory entrance. Workers were shouting, pointing at something. The Duke and Aria moved closer, and what Aria saw made her blood run cold. A man in factory manager's clothing was being restrained by several workers. He was fighting them, cursing, his face twisted with desperation and rage. And in his hand was a leather satchel that Aria recognized. She'd seen the Duke's factory manager carrying it earlier. "Let me go!" the man screamed. "I'm the manager here. I have authority." "You're a lying bastard," one of the workers holding him spat. "We found this in your office. Opened it thinking we'd find evacuation plans. Found this instead." He pulled papers from the satchel, holding them up. Even from a distance, Aria could see they were financial documents, contracts, correspondence. The Duke strode forward, yanking the papers from the worker's hand. His face went absolutely white as he read. "What is it?" Aria asked. The Duke's hands were shaking, with rage, she realized. Pure, barely controlled fury. "This is correspondence between my factory manager and Marcus Brennan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "detailing a plan to sabotage my operations, to make them appear unprofitable or dangerous, to drive down their value so Brennan could buy them at a fraction of their worth." He looked up at the manager, who'd stopped struggling and now looked terrified. "How long?" the Duke demanded. "How long have you been working for Brennan?" The manager's mouth worked soundlessly. "How long?" the Duke roared. 2 years, the manager finally gasped. He paid better, offered me a position in his organization if I helped him acquire your assets. Tonight was supposed to be minor damage, just enough to trigger insurance investigations, raise questions about safety. I didn't know he'd send someone to blow the boiler. I swear, I didn't know people would die. The Duke hit him, a single savage punch that sent the manager sprawling. Then he was on him, dragging him up by his collar. "People did die," the Duke snarled. "My workers. People I'm responsible for, because you sold them out for Brennan's promises." Aria moved forward, putting a hand on the Duke's arm. "Stop. He's not worth it. Let the magistrate handle this." The Duke froze, breathing hard. Then, slowly, he released the manager, letting him collapse back to the ground. "Bind him," he ordered the workers, "and send for the magistrate immediately. This man is under arrest for murder, arson, and treason against lawful commerce." As workers moved to follow his orders, the Duke turned to Aria. The fury was still there, but underneath it she saw something else. Shock, betrayal, and a dawning realization that was clearly painful. "I thought I knew who my enemies were," he said quietly. "I thought the threat was reformers like you, people challenging my methods, my authority. I spent months fighting you while the real danger was inside my own organization. Brennan didn't need to compete with me directly. He just needed to corrupt the people I trusted." "How many other managers might be compromised?" Caleb asked, having joined them. His expression was serious, calculating. "If Brennan placed one person in your operations, he's likely placed more." The Duke's face went even more pale. "My other factories, my warehouses. If there are others like him, then your entire empire might be infiltrated," Caleb finished, "and you won't know who to trust." The full scope of the situation was sinking in now. This wasn't just about one factory fire. It was about a systematic attack on the Duke's operations from the inside, a campaign of sabotage and corruption designed to bring down one of England's most powerful industrial empires. And the Duke, for all his wealth and authority, suddenly looked very alone. Aria found herself speaking before she'd fully thought it through. "You need help, real help. People who aren't on Brennan's payroll and have no reason to betray you." The Duke looked at her sharply. "Are you offering?" "I'm saying that we have a common enemy now. Brennan's corruption isn't just attacking you. It's attacking every worker who depends on stable employment. If he's willing to burn factories and kill people to expand his power, he's worse than anything I've accused you of being." "This is insane," Caleb interjected. "Aria, this man destroyed your family. He's everything we've been fighting against." "No," Aria said, still looking at the Duke. "We've been fighting against cruelty and exploitation. But what happened tonight? That was murder, premeditated, calculated murder. And if we don't stop Brennan, he'll do it again, to other factories, other workers. The difference is Brennan doesn't even pretend to care about profit margins or economic sustainability. He just wants power." The Duke studied her for a long moment, soot-stained and exhausted, but with those gray eyes sharp as ever. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Whitlock? A temporary alliance, Aria said. You have resources and authority I don't. I have connections to workers and reformers you can't access. Together we might be able to identify who else Brennan has corrupted and stop whatever he's planning next. And after we stop Brennan? The Duke asked. Do we go back to being enemies? Resume our battle over factory conditions and workers' rights? Probably, Aria admitted. But at least there will still be factories and workers left to fight over. The Duke almost smiled, a grim expression that didn't reach his eyes. Pragmatic. I can work with pragmatic. He held out his hand. Aria stared at it. This offered truce from the man who'd ruined her family, who represented everything she'd been fighting against. Then she thought about the workers they'd saved together in that burning building, about the children on that ladder, about the enemies neither of them had seen coming because they'd been too focused on each other. She took his hand. One condition, she said. Any workers who lost homes tonight because of this fire, they get housed and compensated. Brennan's attack isn't their fault, and they shouldn't suffer for it. The Duke's grip tightened slightly. Agreed. And one condition for me, you stop making speeches that encourage my workers to strike, at least until we've dealt with Brennan. I can't fight a war on two fronts. I'll consider it, Aria said. Depending on how you treat those workers. Always negotiating, the Duke muttered, but he didn't let go of her hand immediately. Around them, the factory continued to burn, flames lighting up the night sky. Workers were being tended to, the injured carried away, the dead being counted in quiet, horrified voices. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Brennan was probably celebrating what he thought was a successful attack. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He'd given two enemies a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting him instead. And together, Aria thought with a grim satisfaction, she and the Duke might be unstoppable. The war room, as Aria had started calling it in her head, was actually the Duke's private study in his Manchester townhouse, a space that smelled of leather, tobacco, and old money. Maps of England covered one wall marked with pins indicating factory locations. The desk was buried under financial ledgers, worker rosters, and correspondence that might or might not be tainted by Brennan's corruption. Aria sat across from the Duke at 3 a.m, both of them still in their ruined clothes from the fire, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Between them lay the evidence they'd gathered so far. Not much, but enough to paint a disturbing picture. 5 factories, the Duke said, his voice rough with exhaustion. 5 separate incidents in the last 18 months that I attributed to bad luck or worker incompetence. Equipment failures, shipment delays, quality control problems, all of them now looking suspiciously deliberate. And all of them managed by men who've worked for you for years, Aria added, scanning the list of managers they were investigating. Brennan didn't just place new people, he corrupted the ones already there. Which means I can't trust anyone in my own organization. The Duke rubbed his face, leaving new smudges of soot. Every order I give, every plan I make, there's no way to know if it'll reach Brennan within hours. Caleb entered carrying more documents, looking as exhausted as both of them. He'd spent the last few hours tracking down workers from the burned factory, gathering statements, trying to piece together the timeline of tonight's disaster. I found something, he said, dropping the papers on the desk. 3 workers saw the same man hanging around the boiler room over the past week. Different shifts, different days. They all described him the same way. Tall, scar on his left cheek, walks with a limp. That's not an employee, that's surveillance. Brennan was planning this for days, Aria said. Maybe weeks. The manager wasn't just complicit, he actively facilitated it, left doors unlocked, dismissed security concerns, made sure the right person had access at the right time. The Duke stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Dawn was starting to break over Manchester's industrial district, smoke from 100 factory chimneys mixing with the gray light. I should have seen it, he said quietly. Should have questioned why so many problems were occurring in facilities that had run smoothly for years. But I was too focused on expansion, on beating competitors, on proving that my methods worked better than the reformers' idealism. He turned back to face Aria, and she saw something in his expression she'd never expected. Genuine remorse. I was too focused on fighting you, he continued, so certain that workers' advocacy was the real threat to industrial progress. Meanwhile, real criminals were dismantling everything I'd built from the inside. Don't, Aria said sharply. Don't start flagellating yourself with guilt. It's not useful. Brennan counted on you being distracted, and he counted on me being angry enough to keep you distracted. We both played into his hands. The question now is what we do about it. The Duke almost smiled. You're very practical when you're not making speeches about moral imperatives. I contain multitudes, Aria said dryly. Now sit down. We need a plan. Over the next hour, they built one. It was dangerous, probably insane, and required trusting people they had no reason to trust. But it was also the only strategy that had any chance of working. We can investigate every manager and foreman in your empire, Aria said, sketching out the basic framework. Brennan would hear about it immediately and either accelerate his timeline or go to ground. Instead, we need to make him think he's winning. Give him a target he can't resist. What kind of target? Caleb asked. Me, the Duke said. He'd caught on to Aria's thinking. We let it leak that I'm distracted by the fire, overwhelmed, starting to lose control. Make Brennan think now is the time to strike hard and finish what he started. And while he's focused on you, we investigate his network from the outside, Aria continued. Use my connections to workers. They see everything, hear everything. If there are more corrupted managers, the workers will know. They might not realize what they're seeing, but if we ask the right questions, we can map Brennan's entire operation without him knowing we're looking, Caleb finished. It could work. Risky, but possible. There's another component, Aria said, looking directly at the Duke. This only works if people believe you're vulnerable, which means you need to actually be vulnerable, publicly. The Duke's expression hardened. Explain. You need to admit mistakes, take responsibility for tonight's deaths, show weakness in a way that makes Brennan and his allies think you're crumbling under pressure. It goes against every instinct you have, but it's the only way to draw him out. You're asking me to destroy my own reputation, the Duke said flatly. I'm asking you to trade pride for strategy, Aria countered. Brennan thinks he knows you, thinks you're too arrogant to ever admit fault. Prove him wrong. Make him underestimate you. Then use that underestimation to destroy him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. The Duke built his empire on projecting invulnerability. Admitting weakness, even strategically, could damage him in ways that went far beyond this immediate crisis. She's right, Caleb said quietly. If you appear strong right now, Brennan will be cautious. He'll consolidate his gains and wait for another opening. But if you appear to be failing, really failing, he'll overreach. And that's when we catch him. The Duke walked back to his desk, staring down at the maps and documents that represented his life's work. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. If I do this, if I publicly take responsibility for the fire and the deaths, there will be consequences beyond Brennan. Parliament will investigate. Competitors will sense blood in the water. Reform movements will use it as ammunition. Everything I've fought to build could collapse. Yes, Aria said simply. It could. But if you don't do this, Brennan wins by default. Your empire falls anyway, but to corruption instead of calculated risk. At least this way, you're choosing the terms of the battle. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, and Aria saw him making the calculation, weighing costs, assessing risks, deciding how much he was willing to sacrifice. All right, he said finally. We'll do it your way. I'll make a public statement this afternoon. Full responsibility. Acknowledgement of failures in my safety protocols. Promise of reform and compensation for victims' families. It needs to sound genuine, Aria warned. Not calculated or strategic. People can smell insincerity. Then I suppose it's fortunate that I actually do feel responsible, the Duke said quietly. 15 people died in that fire, Miss Whitlock. 15 workers who came to their shifts expecting to go home to their families. Making a public statement admitting my failures won't be difficult, meaning it will be even easier. Something shifted in the way Aria looked at him. This wasn't the cold aristocrat from the ballroom. This was someone capable of genuine feeling, buried under layers of protection and pragmatism. Good, she said. Then let's write that statement. And after you deliver it, I'll start working the other angle, which is talking to workers, the ones Brennan thinks are too insignificant to matter. They're going to help us bring him down. The Duke's public statement made headlines across England by evening. Standing in front of the burned factory ruins, surrounded by journalists and workers, he delivered words that no one had expected to hear from Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne. I take full responsibility for the deaths that occurred here last night. These workers died because safety protocols in my factories were inadequate, because I prioritized efficiency and profit over proper precautions, because I failed in my duty to protect the people whose labor built my success. Aria watched from the crowd, seeing the shock ripple through reporters and workers alike. The Duke continued, his voice steady, but stripped of its usual commanding authority. I cannot undo what happened, cannot bring back the lives lost, but I can commit to meaningful change. Effective immediately, all Hawthorne facilities will undergo comprehensive safety reviews. Working hours will be reduced. Wages will be adjusted to reflect fair compensation rather than market minimums. And families of the deceased will receive financial support sufficient to maintain their households. Your Grace, one reporter called out, are you saying you're adopting the very reforms that workers' advocates have been demanding? The Duke's jaw tightened, but he answered honestly. I'm saying that I was wrong. That economic efficiency built on human suffering is no efficiency at all. That the cost of maintaining my business model became too high the moment 15 people died because I didn't adequately protect them. After the statement ended and the crowd dispersed, Caleb found Aria near the factory gates. That was either brilliant or suicidal, he said. Possibly both. The reaction is already spreading. Some people are calling him heroic for taking responsibility. Others are saying it's proof he's always been negligent. And Brennan's people are definitely watching. Good, Aria said. Let them watch. While they're focused on the Duke's public collapse, we'll be building our case against them. Over the next week, Aria did something she'd never done before. She became invisible. Not the exiled merchant's daughter making speeches, not the Duke's unlikely ally, just another woman moving through working-class neighborhoods, asking quiet questions, listening to stories. She started in Millbrook, the village where she'd first met displaced workers months ago. The woman whose husband had lost his arm recognized her immediately. Miss Whitlock, heard you were working with the Duke now. Some folks say you sold out. Others say you finally got smart. I'm trying to get smart, Aria said honestly, and I need help. There was a fire at Hawthorne Mill number 4. 15 people died. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. The woman's expression softened slightly. What kind of help? Information about managers who might not be what they seem, workers who've noticed strange things happening in factories. Anything that doesn't add up. Word spread through the displaced workers' network faster than Aria had anticipated. By the third day, she had a list of 23 separate incidents across 7 different facilities, all small things individually, but forming a pattern when viewed together. Managers dismissing safety concerns, unexpected equipment modifications, workers being reassigned away from their normal posts right before problems occurred. Beatrice helped her organize the information, cross-referencing it with Caleb's financial records and the Duke's operational documents. Patterns emerged, a web of corruption that went deeper than anyone had suspected. It's not just Brennan's direct employees, Beatrice said, studying their compiled notes. He's got union organizers on his payroll too, legitimate reformers who think they're fighting for workers' rights, not realizing they're being manipulated to destabilize Hawthorne operations at strategic moments. So some of the strikes and protests I've been supporting, Aria's stomach turned. Some were genuine. Some were Brennan's orchestration. He's playing both sides, making himself appear to be the solution to problems he's creating. Aria thought about the speeches she'd made, the workers she'd encouraged to stand up to the Duke. How many of those moments had served Brennan's agenda instead of genuine reform? I've been an idiot, she said quietly. You've been passionate, Beatrice corrected. There's a difference. Passion can be misdirected. Idiocy is when you keep making the same mistakes after you know better. What matters now is what you do with this information. What Aria did was take it to the Duke. They met in his study again, late at night when the household staff was asleep. The Duke looked worse than he had after the fire. The public condemnation following his statement had been brutal. Editorial cartoons depicted him as a heartless industrialist finally confronted with consequences. Reform groups were calling for criminal charges. His own allies in Parliament were distancing themselves. "You look terrible," Aria said bluntly. "Thank you for that observation," the Duke replied, pouring himself whiskey and not offering her any. "I assume you have information that makes this humiliation worthwhile?" Aria spread her compiled evidence across his desk. "Brennan has operatives in 7 of your facilities, 3 managers, 2 foremen, and at least a dozen workers placed strategically to cause maximum disruption. But more importantly," she pulled out a separate document, "he's been using reform movements as cover, financing protests and strikes through intermediaries, making it look like workers' advocacy when it's actually sabotage." The Duke studied the documents, his expression growing darker. "Names? Everyone we've identified. Some are genuine reformers who don't know they're being used. Others are deliberate plants. The question is how we use this information without exposing our investigation." "We don't," the Duke said. "Not yet. This proves Brennan's network is bigger than we thought. If we move against him now with partial information, the parts we haven't identified will go underground. We need the complete picture." "Which means letting him keep operating," Aria said. "Letting him think he's winning." "Yes. How many more people do you need to interview to complete the map?" Aria consulted her notes. "Maybe 24 workers across the remaining facilities. Another week, possibly 2. But there's a problem. Brennan's people are getting suspicious. Workers I've talked to have been questioned afterward. Nothing aggressive yet, but they're watching." "Then we need to give them something else to focus on," the Duke said. He stood, pacing again, his thinking posture Aria had learned. "Another crisis, something that makes them believe their strategy is working so well they don't need to worry about quiet investigations." "What kind of crisis?" The Duke stopped pacing, turning to face her with an expression that made Aria's stomach clench with foreboding. "A very public, very dramatic confrontation between you and me," he said, "in front of workers, journalists, everyone. You accuse me of using the fire as a publicity stunt. I defend myself badly. We make it look like our alliance has collapsed under the weight of fundamental disagreements." "That would destroy any credibility I have with reformers," Aria said slowly. "They already think I've compromised by working with you. If I publicly attack you after you've made concessions, you'll look principled but unreasonable," the Duke finished. "Someone who can't accept progress because it doesn't match your exact demands." "Yes. It'll damage your reputation, probably permanently." "And yours?" "Mine is already in ruins. A few more accusations won't make much difference." He paused. "But it would give Brennan exactly what he wants. Proof that reform movements and industrial interests can't coexist. That any attempt at compromise fails. It would make him confident, careless." Aria walked to the window, looking out at the dark city. The Duke was asking her to sacrifice something she'd spent months building, her position as a voice for workers' rights, her credibility with the very people she'd been trying to help. "There has to be another way," she said. "There probably is," the Duke agreed, "but not one that works as quickly or as certainly. Brennan is planning something. I can feel it. Another attack, bigger than the factory fire. If we don't move fast enough to stop him, more people will die. And all our careful investigation won't matter because there won't be anything left to save." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "I know what I'm asking," he said quietly. "I know the cost. And I know you have no reason to trust that I'll remember your sacrifice after this is over. But I'm asking anyway, because you're right about something you said in that ballroom months ago. I do have power, and I'm choosing to use it to stop a man who makes me look merciful by comparison. But I can't do it without you." Aria closed her eyes, thinking about the workers who'd died in the fire, the families who'd lost everything, the corrupted system that allowed men like Brennan to operate in shadows, while people like her and the Duke fought each other in daylight. "If we do this," she said, "you keep your promises about reform. Not just temporarily. Not just until the crisis passes. Permanently. Real wages, safe conditions, reasonable hours. I want it documented. Legally binding." "Agreed. And when this is over, when Brennan is dealt with, you don't use my damaged reputation as an excuse to dismiss reform movements. You listen to the next person who challenges you, even if they do it as badly as I did." The Duke was quiet for a moment, then, also agreed. Aria opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. Then let's plan how to destroy me. The confrontation happened 3 days later at a workers' assembly in Birmingham. The Duke had announced he'd be speaking about implementation of his promised reforms. Aria arrived uninvited, pushing through the crowd to the front of the hall. "Before you begin," she called out, her voice carrying through the space, "I think these workers deserve to know the truth about your sudden conversion to caring about their welfare." The Duke, standing at the podium, showed perfect surprise. "Miss Whitlock, I wasn't aware you'd be attending. Because you didn't invite me." "Interesting, considering we've supposedly been working together? Or was that just theater for the newspapers?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Workers who'd been at the Sheffield meeting recognized both of them. Journalists present immediately started taking notes. "I have nothing to hide," the Duke said carefully. "My commitment to reform is genuine." "Is it?" Aria pulled out documents, real ones, carefully selected to look damning out of context. "Then explain these. Contracts signed after the fire that maintain the same wage structures you promised to change. Equipment orders that prioritize production speed over safety modifications. Your comprehensive safety review that's actually just a public relations campaign." She was improvising some of it, but the core accusations were based on real documents that had legitimate explanations. The Duke knew this. The point wasn't truth, it was performance. "Those contracts were pre-existing obligations," the Duke said, his voice rising. "I can't simply ignore legal commitments." "You can if you actually care more about people than profits," Aria interrupted. "But you don't. This whole display of remorse and reform is calculated damage control. You're not changing anything fundamental. You're just finding better ways to exploit workers while making it look compassionate." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Aria turned to address the crowd directly. "I made a mistake trusting him. Thinking that one tragedy would change a man who's built his fortune on treating people as disposable. The Duke of Hawthorne will never truly reform because his entire identity is built on being superior to people like you. Like me. Like anyone who doesn't have a title and inherited wealth." The Duke's face flushed, genuine anger breaking through the performance, which made it all the more convincing. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, voice tight. "I've made concessions, admitted mistakes, committed to real change. If that's not enough for you..." "It's not enough because it's not real," Aria shot back. "And I won't stand here and watch workers be manipulated into accepting crumbs when they deserve the whole meal. You're a liar, Your Grace. A very convincing one, but still a liar." She turned and walked out, leaving chaos behind her. Workers shouting questions, journalists scrambling to follow her. The Duke standing at the podium looking betrayed and furious. It was perfect. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Reform Alliance collapses in dramatic confrontation. Whitlock accuses Duke of deception. Workers' advocate breaks with aristocratic reformer. Aria read the headlines in Beatrice's drawing room, feeling sick to her stomach. She'd accomplished exactly what they'd intended. Destroyed her credibility, made the Duke look victimized by unreasonable demands, created the appearance of complete dysfunction. "The response from reform groups is brutal," Caleb reported, bringing in more newspapers. "They're calling you uncompromising, destructive, someone who'd rather have purity than progress. Your name is becoming synonymous with failed radicalism." "Good," Aria said, though the word tasted like ash. "Then Brennan should be feeling very confident right now." He was. The proof came 2 days later when one of the workers Aria had interviewed, a woman named Sarah who worked in the Duke's Birmingham facility, sent an urgent message. Aria met her in a quiet corner of a market, both of them pretending to shop while talking in low voices. "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Sarah whispered. "My manager is organizing it. Says it's about protecting workers' interests now that the Duke's reform promises have failed. But the way he talks about it, it doesn't feel right. Feels like something else." "What kind of meeting?" Aria asked. "Not sure, but he specifically mentioned that workers from all the Hawthorne facilities should attend. Said it's time to take control of our own futures since we can't rely on either aristocrats or advocates." Sarah's eyes were worried. "Miss Whitlock, I think something bad is being planned. Something that uses workers as cover for something worse." Aria's pulse quickened. "Where's this meeting happening?" Riverside Warehouse District, the big storage facility near the docks, tomorrow at midnight. That night, Aria brought the information to the Duke. He listened carefully, then pulled out maps of the warehouse district. Riverside is Brennan's territory, he said grimly. He owns half the warehouses there through shell companies. If he's gathering workers from my facilities in his space, he's planning something public, Aria finished. Something that uses workers as witnesses or participants. Makes whatever he does look like grassroots action instead of criminal conspiracy. Or he's planning to eliminate a large number of witnesses at once, the Duke said quietly. He knows we've been investigating. Maybe not the full extent, but enough to know workers are talking. If he removes enough of them in one incident, another fire, Aria breathed, but this time deliberately targeting workers who might expose his network. The Duke's hands clenched into fists. I won't allow it. We move tomorrow night. Full magistrate involvement, armed enforcement, everything. No, Aria said. If you come in with authorities, Brennan disappears and his network goes underground. We'll have saved these workers but accomplished nothing else. He'll just rebuild and try again. Then what do you suggest? Let workers walk into a trap? No, we spring the trap early, on our terms. Aria was thinking fast, pieces clicking together. Brennan expects workers to show up at midnight. Instead, I show up at 11 with people he won't expect. We confront him before his plan is in motion, force him to reveal his intentions, and make sure the magistrate arrives in time to witness everything. That's incredibly dangerous, the Duke said. Yes, but it's also the only way to catch him in the act while protecting the workers he's targeting. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Who are these people Brennan won't expect? Aria smiled grimly. Reform mill owners who hate what Brennan's doing to the industry. Genuine labor advocates who've realized they've been manipulated. Journalists who want the real story. And you. Me. You. The Duke of Hawthorne, showing up at a workers' meeting in Brennan's territory. He'll never see it coming, and he won't be able to resist gloating about how he's destroyed you. And while he's gloating, the magistrate arrives with enough witnesses to make sure his confession sticks, the Duke finished. It could work, if we survive it. We survived a collapsing factory, Aria reminded him. This should be easy by comparison. It wasn't. The Riverside warehouse was exactly as foreboding as Aria had expected. Massive, dark, smelling of river water and old timber. She arrived just before 11 with her assembled group, Caleb and 3 other mill owners who'd agreed to testify against Brennan, 2 journalists, a handful of workers who'd been feeding her information, and the Duke, dressed in plain clothes that did nothing to disguise his aristocratic bearing. The warehouse's main floor was empty except for crates and shadows, but light showed from the upper level, a large room that overlooked the docks. That's where they'd find Brennan. Aria led the way up rickety stairs, her heart hammering. This was it. Everything they'd worked for, planned for, sacrificed for, coming down to whatever happened in the next 30 minutes. The upper room was bigger than expected, with windows overlooking the river. And standing in the center, looking utterly unsurprised, was Marcus Brennan. He was shorter than Aria had imagined, stocky and well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed the coldness in his eyes. Several men stood with him, the type whose primary job description was intimidation. Miss Whitlock, Brennan said pleasantly, early for our midnight gathering, and you brought friends. How thoughtful. We know what you're planning, Aria said, stepping into the room. We know about your network, your corrupted managers, the factory fire, all of it. Brennan smiled. Do you? And what exactly do you plan to do with this knowledge? Go to the authorities with accusations you can't prove? I'm a legitimate businessman, Miss Whitlock. Everything I do is legal, or at least legal enough. You murdered 15 people, the Duke said, stepping forward, ordered the destruction of my property, corrupted my employees. That's not legal in any interpretation. Your Grace, Brennan's smile widened. I heard you'd fallen on hard times. Public disgrace, failed reforms, betrayed by your supposed ally. Must be difficult, watching your empire crumble. My empire is fine, the Duke said coldly, but yours is about to end. Is it? Brennan gestured to his men. You're in my warehouse, in my territory, with no authority and no proof. Even if you had evidence, who would believe the desperate accusations of a disgraced duke and a radical troublemaker? You've destroyed each other's credibility so thoroughly that anything you say now sounds like conspiracy theories. He had a point. Aria and the duke had performed their animosity so convincingly that working together now would seem suspicious. But that was also Brennan's weakness. He'd bought their performance completely. "You're right," Aria said. "We did destroy each other's credibility, which is why we brought witnesses who still have theirs." Caleb stepped forward, holding up documents. "Financial records proving your shell companies purchased equipment that was used to sabotage Hawthorne facilities. Testimony from workers you attempted to bribe. Correspondence between you and the managers you corrupted." The journalists were already taking notes, their expressions sharp with professional interest. Brennan's smile faltered slightly. "Stolen documents, coerced testimony, none of that would hold up in court." "Perhaps not alone," the Duke said, "but combined with a magistrate witnessing you attempt to murder everyone in this room, that might be more convincing." Brennan went very still. "What?" "You were planning to eliminate witnesses tonight," Aria said. "Workers who talked to me, people who could expose your network. That's why you called this meeting, not to organize them, but to dispose of them. But we moved your timeline up, and the magistrate will be here in..." She checked the clock on the wall. "Approximately 5 minutes, which gives you just enough time to confess or run. Either way, we win." For the first time, genuine fear crossed Brennan's face. Then rage. He gestured sharply to his men. "Kill them. All of them. Now!" The men moved forward, drawing weapons, clubs, knives. One even had a pistol. The Duke stepped in front of Aria instinctively, his face set in grim determination. But before the violence could begin, the warehouse doors below crashed open. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. And the magistrate arrived with a dozen constables, all armed, all taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Marcus Brennan," the magistrate called out. "You're under arrest for arson, murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and destruction of property. Drop your weapons, all of you." Brennan's men hesitated, looking at their employer. For a moment, Aria thought he might actually order them to fight anyway. Then his shoulders sagged, defeat settling over him like a shroud. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at the Duke. "I have allies, resources. You've won a battle, Hawthorne, not the war." "Maybe," the Duke agreed. "But you're going to prison. Your network is exposed. Your operations are finished. I'll take that victory and build on it." As constables moved in to arrest Brennan and his men, the Duke turned to Aria. "We did it," he said quietly. "Actually did it." "We did," Aria agreed. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline and relief and the delayed terror of how close they'd come to disaster. "Though I'd prefer not to do anything like it again." "Agreed." The Duke smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I'm getting too old for collapsing buildings and midnight confrontations with criminals." The journalists were already rushing to file their stories. By morning, all of England would know about Brennan's arrest, the Duke and Aria's secret collaboration, and the network of corruption they'd exposed. The narrative would shift again. Not the disgraced Duke and the failed radical, but unlikely allies who'd set aside their differences to stop a greater threat. "Your reputation might actually recover from this," Caleb said, joining them as constables led Brennan away. "Both of your reputations. The public loves a redemption story." "I don't care about redemption," Aria said. "I care about making sure this meant something, that workers are actually protected, that reform actually happens." The Duke met her gaze steadily. "We made promises, legal, binding promises. I intend to keep them. You'll hold me accountable for that?" "Count on it," Aria said. "Good." He held out his hand again, as he had that night in the burning factory. "Then let's finish what we started. Properly this time. Together." Aria looked at his offered hand, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. The ballroom confrontation, her family's destruction, the exile in rage and desperate need to prove she was right, the fire that had changed everything, the alliance built on mutual necessity rather than trust. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. She took his hand. "Together," she agreed. The weeks following Brennan's arrest didn't bring the triumph Aria had imagined during all those angry months in exile. Instead, they brought exhaustion, complications, and the slow, grinding work of actually changing things. The Duke's townhouse had become their headquarters by necessity. Every day brought new problems, corrupted managers to replace, safety protocols to implement, compensation claims to process, and workers to reassure that the promised reforms weren't just temporary theatrics. Aria found herself working 16-hour days alongside the Duke, Caleb, and a rotating cast of mill owners, reformers, and government officials who'd suddenly decided industrial reform was a political priority. "This is impossible," she said one evening, 3 weeks after Brennan's arrest. She was surrounded by worker testimonies that needed verification, financial projections for implementing new wage structures, and architectural plans for factory modifications. "We're trying to rebuild an entire industrial system while it's still operating. It's like repairing a ship while sailing through a storm." The Duke looked up from his own mountain of documents. He'd lost weight, she noticed. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but there was something different in his expression now. Less arrogance, more determination. "Would you prefer we waited until the perfect moment," he asked, "when conditions are calm and everyone's ready for change?" "That moment will never come," Aria admitted, "which is why this is so frustrating. Every change we make creates 10 new problems." "Welcome to actual reform," Caleb said from across the room, where he was reviewing contracts with 2 other mill owners. "This is what it looks like when you stop making speeches and start implementing policy. It's messy, complicated, and absolutely necessary." A knock on the door interrupted them. One of the Duke's servants entered, looking uncomfortable. "Your Grace, there's someone here to see Miss Whitlock. Says it's urgent." Aria's stomach tightened. Urgent visits were rarely good news. "Who is it?" "A Mr. Whitlock, miss, says he's your father." The room went silent. Aria hadn't heard from her parents since her mother's devastating letter months ago. She'd assumed, hoped maybe, that they'd accepted her exile as permanent, that she could move forward without confronting what she'd cost them. Apparently not. "Show him in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her father looked older. That was her first thought when he entered the Duke's study. Gray hair that had been dark last year, new lines carved deep into his face, clothes that were still expensive but slightly worn, suggesting financial pressure he was trying to hide. "Father," Aria said, standing, "I didn't expect to see you." "No, I imagine not." His voice was cold, controlled. "Given that you've spent the last months publicly humiliating our family while cavorting with the very man who destroyed us." The Duke stood as well, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Whitlock, I'm sorry for the circumstances of our meeting." "Are you?" Her father's gaze was sharp, assessing. "Are you sorry for what you did to my family? Or just sorry you've been caught manipulating my daughter for your own purposes?" "Father, it's not like that," Aria started. "Isn't it?" He pulled out a newspaper, one of many that had run stories about the Brennan investigation. The disgraced merchant's daughter and the reformed Duke working together to expose corruption. It makes for compelling reading. Excellent publicity for your reform efforts. Meanwhile, my business is still failing, your mother is still ostracized from society, and you're here playing politics as if none of that matters. The accusation hit harder than Aria expected, because he wasn't entirely wrong. She'd been so focused on the larger fight, stopping Brennan, implementing reforms, changing the industrial system, that she hadn't thought about what her continued association with the Duke meant for her family. "I'm trying to fix things," she said quietly. "By making them worse?" Her father's voice rose. "You destroyed us once with your pride. Now you're doing it again by aligning yourself with our enemy. Do you have any idea what people are saying? That the Whitlocks are social climbers who sent their daughter to seduce a Duke? That you're his mistress now, bought and paid for? That everything you claimed to stand for was just positioning for a better match? That's not true." "It doesn't matter if it's true," her father shouted. "It's what people believe. And every day you spend here working with him gives them more ammunition. You wanted to fight for workers' rights? Congratulations. You've become a cautionary tale about women who forget their place." The Duke had gone very still, his expression dark. "Mr. Whitlock, I understand your anger. I caused your family considerable harm, but your daughter has accomplished more in the last month than most people achieve in a lifetime. She deserves—" "You don't get to tell me what my daughter deserves," her father interrupted. You destroyed our family. The fact that you're now using her talents for your own redemption doesn't absolve you of that." "He's right," Aria said quietly. Both men looked at her in surprise. "Father is right. You did destroy us, Your Grace, and working with you has made things worse for my family. The question is whether that cost is worth what we're accomplishing." She moved to the window, looking out at the darkening city. "I made a choice in that ballroom, a stupid, prideful choice that I knew would have consequences. But I made it because I believed, still believe, that someone has to challenge the system, has to refuse to accept exploitation as inevitable. Maybe I was naive about how to do that effectively, but I wasn't wrong about the need." She turned back to face her father. "I can't undo what I've cost you, can't give you back your business or mother's social position, but I can keep fighting to create a world where other people's children don't have to choose between speaking truth and protecting their families, where workers don't die because profit matters more than safety, where power isn't something inherited and hoarded, but something earned through actual merit." "Pretty words," her father said bitterly. "They don't pay creditors or restore reputations." "No," Aria agreed. "They don't. But maybe this will." She looked at the Duke, who seemed to understand what she was asking before she said it. "Your father's business," he said slowly. "The contracts that were terminated. I could restore them. Not identical terms that would look too obviously like compensation, but equivalent opportunities. New shipping arrangements that would stabilize your finances." Her father's expression was torn between hope and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Because your daughter is right about more things than I've wanted to admit," the Duke said, "including the fact that I was cruel when I didn't need to be. I could have responded to her ballroom challenge with dismissal or mild social consequences. Instead, I chose destruction. That was excessive, unjust, and reversible if you're willing to accept the help." "At what cost?" her father demanded. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," the Duke said. "Consider it part of my penance for past arrogance. Though I should warn you, accepting help from me will probably generate its own gossip. People will speculate about motives and arrangements. You'll have to decide if restored finances are worth potential social complications." Her father looked at Aria, really looked at her for the first time since entering the room. "Is this what you want? For me to be indebted to him?" "I want you to survive," Aria said honestly. "However you choose to do that. If accepting the Duke's offer means you and Mother can rebuild, then yes, I want you to accept it. If you'd rather refuse on principle and find your own way forward, I'll respect that too. But either way, I'm not apologizing for the choices I've made. They cost more than I expected, but they also mattered more than I knew." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Then her father sighed, seeming to deflate slightly. "Your mother wants to see you," he said quietly. "She won't admit it, probably won't forgive you, but she asks about you, reads every newspaper article. She's terrified and proud and furious all at once." "Tell her," Aria's voice caught. "Tell her I'm sorry for the pain, but not for the purpose." Her father nodded slowly, then to the Duke. "I'll consider your offer. Send the details to my solicitor. But don't expect gratitude. I'm accepting out of practical necessity, not reconciliation." "I wouldn't expect anything else," the Duke said. After her father left, Aria stood at the window for a long time, not trusting herself to speak. The Duke came to stand beside her, keeping a careful distance. "That was harder than facing Brennan," he observed. "Yes." Aria's voice was tight. "Brennan was an enemy. My father is—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Family," the Duke supplied, "which makes everything more complicated. I know something about that." "Do you?" Aria glanced at him. "I thought aristocrats were above messy family drama." "We're spectacular at messy family drama. We just hide it better behind titles and inherited estates." He paused. "My father thought I was weak for caring about business efficiency over social dominance. My mother died thinking I'd wasted my potential on commerce instead of politics. I spent years trying to prove them wrong by being exactly what they feared: ruthless, pragmatic, successful by every measure except human decency." "Is that what the factory fire changed?" Aria asked. "Made you realize success without decency was hollow?" "No," the Duke said quietly. That's what you changed. The fire just made it impossible to ignore anymore. Before Aria could respond, Caleb called from across the room. We have a problem. Parliament's calling for an inquiry into industrial practices. They want testimonies from workers, mill owners, and... He looked at Aria and the Duke. Both of you. Public testimony about conditions, reforms, and the Brennan conspiracy. When? The Duke asked. 3 weeks. And it's not optional. They're treating this as a major corruption investigation. Which it is, but it also means everything we've been trying to implement quietly is about to become very public and very political. Aria felt a headache starting behind her eyes. So we'll have to defend our reforms before they're fully implemented, against critics who will say we're either doing too much or not enough, while still trying to actually run the factories and keep workers employed. Exactly, Caleb said. Welcome to hell. Population, us. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation, documentation, and strategic planning. Aria spent hours gathering worker testimonies, organizing evidence of Brennan's network, and coordinating with reformers who wanted to use the parliamentary inquiry as a platform for broader change. The Duke focused on the financial and legal aspects, proving that safety improvements and wage increases were economically sustainable, documenting the cost of Brennan's sabotage, building a case that reform was practical rather than idealistic. They argued constantly about priorities, methods, messaging. Aria wanted to emphasize moral imperatives. The Duke insisted on economic arguments. Caleb mediated, pointing out that they needed both approaches to convince a parliament that cared about morality only when it aligned with money. You're impossible, Aria told the Duke after a particularly heated debate about how to present wage increase proposals. Everything has to be justified through profit calculations. Can't you just admit that treating people decently is the right thing to do, regardless of economics? I could, the Duke said, but Parliament won't. They need to believe reform benefits them financially, or they won't support it. That's reality. I'm sorry if reality doesn't match your preferred narrative. My preferred narrative is one where human lives matter more than profit margins. And my preferred narrative is one where we actually accomplish something instead of making beautiful speeches that change nothing. He rubbed his temples, frustration evident. I'm trying to work within the system that exists, Miss Whitlock, not the one you wish existed. Maybe the system needs to be changed, Aria shot back. Yes, by incremental reform that people can accept, not revolutionary rhetoric that terrifies them into resistance. They were still arguing when Beatrice arrived, took one look at both of them, and ordered everyone out of the room except Aria and the Duke. Sit down, she commanded, both of you, now. They sat, looking like chastised children. Beatrice stood between them, arms crossed, expression severe. You're both right, she said bluntly. You're also both being idiots. Aria, the Duke understands political reality in ways you don't. He knows how to navigate Parliament, manage powerful interests, and implement change without triggering backlash that destroys everything. You need his experience. She turned to the Duke. And you, Your Grace, need her passion. Her ability to make people care about issues you've reduced to economic calculations. Workers don't follow spreadsheets. They follow people who make them believe change is possible. She paused, letting that sink in. You've accomplished something extraordinary together. Exposed corruption, implemented real reforms, changed the conversation about industrial labor. But you're about to testify before Parliament, and if you can't present a united front, they'll tear you both apart and use your conflict as an excuse to maintain the status quo. So, what do you suggest? Aria asked. Stop trying to win arguments against each other and start building a case together. Combine moral imperatives with economic pragmatism. Show Parliament that reform isn't just right, it's profitable. That treating workers decently creates more stable, productive operations. That the choice isn't between ethics and economics, but between short-term exploitation and long-term sustainability. The Duke and Aria looked at each other. Slowly, grudgingly, they both nodded. Fine, Aria said. We'll try it your way. Not my way, Beatrice corrected. Our way. The way that actually works. The parliamentary inquiry began on a gray morning in late spring. The chamber was packed with members of Parliament, journalists, interested aristocrats, and workers who'd been granted rare permission to observe the proceedings. Aria sat in the witness section, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Beatrice had insisted projected both respectability and seriousness. The Duke sat nearby, looking every inch the aristocrat despite the casual contempt some MPs showed when he entered. The first day was brutal. MPs questioned them separately about the Brennan conspiracy, their unlikely alliance, and the reforms they'd implemented. Some questions were genuine, others were clearly designed to embarrass or discredit. "Miss Whitlock," one particularly hostile MP asked, "isn't it true that your initial accusations against the Duke were motivated by personal rejection? That you approached him at a social function seeking attention, were rebuffed, and retaliated with unfounded claims about his business practices?" Aria felt rage building but forced herself to stay calm. "No, sir. My accusations were based on documented evidence of unsafe working conditions and exploitative wages. The Duke's response to those accusations, destroying my family financially, rather proved my point about how power operates in this country." "So you admit to provoking a powerful man and then complaining about the consequences?" "I admit to speaking truth and learning that truth is dangerous when it threatens wealth and privilege." The questioning of the Duke was equally aggressive. MPS demanded to know why he'd suddenly embraced reforms he'd previously opposed, whether his alliance with Aria was genuine or calculated publicity, whether the Brennan investigation was legitimate or a convenient excuse for his own failures. "Your Grace," one MP said with barely concealed disdain, "you spent years building an empire on practices you now claim to regret. How can Parliament trust that your conversion is sincere rather than opportunistic?" The Duke's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You can't trust my sincerity. You can only evaluate my actions. I've implemented wage increases averaging 20% across my facilities, reduced working hours from 16 to 12 per day, installed safety equipment that cut injury rates by 40% in 3 months, established compensation funds for workers disabled in my employ. These changes cost me significantly in short-term profits. If that's opportunism, I'm remarkably bad at it." "Or remarkably good at long-term calculation," the MP countered, "creating good publicity now to expand your influence later." "Believe what you prefer," the Duke said. "The workers benefiting from these changes don't particularly care about my motives. Neither should you." By the third day, Aria and the Duke were both exhausted and frustrated. The inquiry seemed designed more to assign blame than to actually address industrial reform. MPs were more interested in political theater than substantive change. Then something unexpected happened. A group of workers who'd been observing the proceedings requested permission to testify. The committee chair initially refused. Workers weren't considered legitimate witnesses in parliamentary inquiries. But journalists present made enough noise about transparency that the chair grudgingly allowed it. Sarah Mitchell's mother was the first to speak. The woman whose daughter had lost fingers in the Duke's factory stood before Parliament with quiet dignity and told her story. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just factually. "My daughter was 11 when she started working at Hawthorne Mill number 7. She needed to work because her father was dead and I couldn't earn enough alone to feed us. She lost 3 fingers to machinery that had no safety guards. The manager told us it was her fault for being careless. We got no compensation, no medical care. We were evicted from company housing 3 days later." She paused, looking directly at the MPs. Then Miss Whitlock started asking questions, making speeches, challenging the Duke. I thought she was crazy, thought she'd accomplished nothing except her own ruin. I was right about the ruin, wrong about the nothing. Another pause. "My daughter now works in a renovated facility with safety guards on all machinery. She earns enough that I don't have to take in laundry 16 hours a day. We have decent housing. When she was sick last month, the company doctor treated her for free. These aren't promises, they're realities. Because 2 people stopped fighting about who was right and started fighting for what was right." Other workers testified. The man whose lungs had been damaged by cotton dust, now receiving pension support and medical treatment. Families who'd lost members in the factory fire, now compensated enough to survive the loss. Workers who'd been threatened by Brennan's network, now protected by the very system they'd once feared. The testimony lasted hours. By the end, even the most hostile MPs looked uncomfortable. It's one thing to dismiss abstract arguments about reform, Much harder to ignore real people describing real improvements in their lives. That evening, Aria and the Duke waited in a private room while Parliament deliberated. They sat in exhausted silence, too tired to argue, too wired to relax. "Do you think we've done enough?" Aria asked finally. "I don't know," the Duke admitted. "Parliament has its own politics. Our testimony might not matter as much as who owes favors to whom." Then what was the point of all this? The point is that we tried, that workers testified about real change, that we built something that exists regardless of what Parliament decides. He looked at her directly. "You changed me, Miss Whitlock, made me see things I'd been deliberately blind to. Whatever Parliament does, that change is permanent." Aria felt something shift in her chest. "I need to tell you something about that night in the ballroom, when I challenged you. You don't need to explain Yes, I do." She took a breath. "I knew what would happen. Knew you'd retaliate. Part of me wanted that. Wanted the martyrdom. The proof that the system was as corrupt as I believed. I used my family as collateral for my pride, and I've spent months telling myself it was worth it because I was fighting for something important." "Was it?" the Duke asked quietly. "Worth it? I don't know. I destroyed my parents' lives to make a point. That's not heroic. It's selfish. The fact that something good eventually came from it doesn't absolve me of the cost." "We're quite a pair," the Duke said. "You sacrificing your family for principles. Me sacrificing principles for empire. Both of us learning too late that the costs were higher than we calculated." Before Aria could respond, Caleb entered, his expression unreadable. "Parliament's reached a decision," he said. "They want both of you back in chambers." The walk back felt eternal. Aria's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd faced down the Duke, survived a factory fire, confronted Brennan in his own territory. But somehow this felt more consequential. The chamber was silent as they entered, every seat filled, every eye watching. The committee chair stood reading from a prepared statement. "This committee has reviewed extensive testimony regarding industrial practices, corruption, and proposed reforms. We've heard from workers, managers, mill owners, and the accused parties themselves. Our findings are as follows." He paused, drawing out the moment. "Marcus Brennan and his associates are guilty of criminal conspiracy, arson, and murder. Warrants will be issued for all identified co-conspirators. His assets will be seized and distributed as restitution to affected families." Relief, but that was expected. The next part was what mattered. Regarding the practices of Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne and similar industrial operations, this committee finds that while past practices were legal under current statutes, they were demonstrably harmful to worker welfare and public interest. Therefore, Parliament will draft new legislation establishing minimum safety standards, maximum working hours, and fair wage requirements for all industrial facilities in England. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. This was more than anyone had expected. Actual legislation, not just recommendations. Furthermore, the chair continued, we recognize the unprecedented collaboration between Miss Aria Whitlock and Duke Hawthorne in exposing corruption and implementing voluntary reforms. Their example demonstrates that progressive change and economic sustainability are not mutually exclusive. Parliament commends their efforts and encourages other industrialists to follow their example. The chair looked directly at Aria and the Duke. You've proven that the system can change when people of courage and conviction work together despite their differences. England is better for your efforts. The chamber erupted. Some applause, some argument, everyone talking at once. But Aria barely heard it. She was looking at the Duke, seeing the same stunned relief on his face that she felt. They'd done it. Actually done it. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Outside the parliamentary building, crowds had gathered. Workers who'd traveled from factories across England, reformers who'd supported Aria's early efforts, journalists scrambling for statements. The noise was overwhelming. "Miss Whitlock," someone shouted, "do you consider this a victory?" Aria looked at the expectant faces, thought about everything they'd been through, and gave the only honest answer she had. "It's a beginning," she said. "Real change doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in the slow, grinding work of implementation. What Parliament decided today matters, but what matters more is what we do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Making sure these reforms actually reach workers, making sure they're enforced, making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we did. She glanced at the Duke, who'd moved to stand beside her. I spent months hating this man, convinced he represented everything wrong with England. I was partly right, but I was also partly wrong. He's capable of change, of growth, of choosing to be better than the system that raised him. If he can change, the system can change. We just have to keep pushing it. The Duke stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. Miss Whitlock is correct. This is a beginning. I'm committing my resources to ensuring these reforms succeed, not from altruism, though I've learned something about that, but from practical recognition that sustainable industry requires sustainable workers. I'm calling on other mill owners to join this effort, to compete on quality and innovation rather than exploitation, to build an economic system that serves everyone, not just those born into wealth. Someone in the crowd shouted, "What about the Whitlock family? Will you compensate them for what you did?" The Duke didn't hesitate. I'm restoring their business contracts and providing additional support to offset damages caused by my excessive retaliation. Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock didn't deserve to suffer for their daughter's courage. I'm attempting to rectify that injustice. Another voice called out, "Are you and Miss Whitlock working together now? Is this a partnership?" Aria and the Duke looked at each other. In that moment, she saw everything they'd been through reflected in his gray eyes. The hatred, the fear, the fire. The alliance built on necessity that had somehow become something more complex than either had anticipated. "Yes," she said simply, "we're working together. Not because we agree on everything. We don't. Not because we've resolved all our differences. We haven't. But because we've learned that effective change requires both idealism and pragmatism, passion and strategy. Someone who makes people care, and someone who makes things work." She felt the Duke's hand brush against hers, not quite holding it, but acknowledging her presence. "Besides," Aria added, with the first real smile she'd managed in weeks, "someone needs to keep him honest. Might as well be me." The crowd laughed, the tension breaking. Journalists scribbled notes, workers cheered, and somewhere in London, Aria knew, her parents were reading about this moment and trying to decide whether to be horrified or proud. She hoped for proud, suspected she'd get a complicated mixture, could live with that. As the crowd dispersed and the immediate chaos settled, Caleb appeared at Aria's elbow. "You two have created something extraordinary, a genuine reform movement with both grassroots support and institutional backing. Do you have any idea what to do with it?" "Not really," Aria admitted, "but I'm learning that not having all the answers doesn't mean you can't move forward." "Spoken like someone who's been through hell and survived," Caleb said. "So what's next? More factory reforms, expanding to other industries, political office?" Aria laughed at that last suggestion. "I think I've had enough of formal politics for now, but there's still work to do. Workers who need representation, systems that need changing, injustices that need challenging." "And you'll keep working with him?" Caleb nodded toward the Duke, who was speaking with parliamentary allies a few feet away. "Yes," Aria said, surprised by her own certainty. "He's frustrating and arrogant and still thinks economic arguments trump moral ones. But he's also competent and committed and willing to risk his reputation for what he believes is right. We balance each other. It works." "It's more than that," Caleb observed quietly. "But you'll figure that out eventually." Before Aria could ask what he meant, the Duke returned, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Parliament wants to form a commission to oversee industrial reform implementation," he said. "They've requested we both serve on it, along with Caleb and several workers' representatives." "When?" Aria asked. "Immediately. First meeting is next week." He paused. "It's a 10-year appointment, significant time commitment, probably more arguments between us about methodology and priorities. Definitely more long nights reviewing policy proposals instead of sleeping." "Sounds terrible," Aria said. "It does, doesn't it?" The Duke's expression softened. "Will you do it anyway?" Aria thought about the journey that had brought her here, the ballroom confrontation that had seemed like an ending, the exile that had felt like death, the fire that had changed everything, the unlikely alliance that had saved both of them from their worst impulses. She thought about her parents, slowly rebuilding their lives with the Duke's help, about workers who'd testified before Parliament with quiet courage, about Beatrice, who taught her that passion without strategy was just noise, about Caleb, who'd believed in reform when it was dangerous to do so. And she thought about the Duke, the man who'd been her enemy and became her partner, who'd destroyed her family and then helped restore them, who'd been cruel and learned compassion, who'd built an empire on exploitation and was now dismantling those foundations to build something better. It wasn't a fairy tale. They hadn't fallen in love and solved everything with romantic passion, but they'd built something more durable than romance, mutual respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that they were more effective together than apart. "Yes," Aria said. "I'll do it, on one condition." "What's that?" "You stop calling me Miss Whitlock. We're going to be working together for 10 years. We've survived fires and conspiracies and parliamentary inquiries. I think we're past formal titles." The Duke smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Agreed. But only if you stop calling me Your Grace. It makes me feel like I'm still the man I was in that ballroom." "What should I call you then?" "Nathaniel. My actual name, which almost no one uses." "Nathaniel," Aria repeated, testing it. It felt strange, but right. "All right. Partners, then. In reform and revolution." "Partners," Nathaniel agreed. He held out his hand, and this time when Aria took it, there was no pretense, no performance. Just two people who'd fought their way through hell and emerged on the other side changed, challenged, and somehow stronger for it. The sun broke through London's perpetual clouds, casting light across the city they were going to change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but meaningfully, methodically, with the kind of persistent effort that actually creates lasting transformation. Aria looked at the city spread before them, factories and tenements, palaces and slums, wealth and poverty existing side by side. It was overwhelming, impossible, the kind of challenge that reasonable people would refuse because the odds of success were too small. Good thing neither of them had ever been particularly reasonable. "So," Nathaniel said, still holding her hand, "where do we start?" Aria smiled, feeling something that might have been hope, or might have been stubborn defiance, or might have been both. "Same place we always start," she said. "By refusing to accept that things can't change, and then making sure they do." Together, they walked back into the building where Parliament was already drafting the legislation that would reshape English industry. There would be fights ahead, resistance, setbacks, failures that would test everything they'd built, but they'd face it together. The merchant's daughter who dared to speak truth, and the Duke who'd learned to listen. Two people who'd started as enemies and become something more complex and valuable, allies, partners, and the architects of a new order forged in fire and built on the stubborn conviction that courage mattered more than status, and change was possible when people refused to accept the world as it was. The future was uncertain. The work was daunting. The odds were against them. But for the first time since that ballroom confrontation that had changed everything, Aria felt ready for whatever came next, because she wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. And that, more than any speech or reform or legislative victory, was the real revolution.